All right, let's jump into our deep dive today. Vietnam. I'm really excited about this one. We're going to try to get under the surface here, go way beyond the usual tourist stuff, and really understand what makes Vietnam tick. And wow, look at this pile of sources. We've got maps and history books and economic data. Looks like we even have some firsthand accounts of daily life, so that's going to be cool.
Yeah, it's going to be like putting together a giant puzzle, Each piece, each source adds a little bit more to the picture.
Exactly. And one image I saw that I just loved was this description of Vietnam as, get this, a bamboo stand with 2 rice bowls. I mean, how cool is that? It just immediately gets you thinking about the geography.
Yeah, it's a great visual, right? You instantly get that long, narrow shape of the country. And those 2 rice bowls, well, that's got to be the fertile deltas at each end. The Red River Delta in the north and, of course, the Mekong Delta in the south. Rice is such a huge part of Vietnamese life, so it makes sense, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And those deltas are connected by that mountainous spine running down the length of the country. And actually, speaking of the landscape, the sources mention 5 distinct types of landscapes, each with its own personality, I guess you could say. We've got the Yin and Hockland up north bordering China. Then there's that Red River Delta we were just talking about around Hanoi. And of course, the Mekong Delta, like you said, super important for agriculture.
And we can't forget about the Annamite Highlands, right? That's where a lot of Vietnam's ethnic minority groups live. And then there's that Annamite coastal strip, which I gotta say looks absolutely breathtaking in the pictures. I mean, it's incredible how these different landscapes have shaped not just the look of Vietnam, but also, its culture and how it's developed economically.
Totally. And then on top of all that, you've got this big difference in climate between north and south, right? Subtropical in the north with those 4 distinct seasons, and then tropical down south, hot and humid all year round. I bet life feels pretty different in those 2 regions.
Oh, absolutely. The sources actually talked about this one spot called the Hai Van Pass, or sometimes it's called the Cloud Pass. And apparently, as soon as you cross it, you can feel the temperature and humidity change. It's like stepping through some kind of invisible doorway.
Wow, seriously. That's wild. It makes you think, did that geographic separation and the climate difference, did that lead to different, regional identities within Vietnam? Do people in the north see themselves as different from people in the south?
Oh, that's a really good question. It also makes me think about how the sources mention Vietnam being vulnerable to typhoons, especially down in that Mekong Delta area. Kind of reminds you that that geography isn't always sunshine and roses, It can be a source of risk, too.
Right, for sure. Okay, so we've got this picture in our minds of a geographically diverse country, complex climate. Now, let's rewind the clock a bit, way back, and talk history. I mean, we're talking thousands of years here.
Yeah, deep history. The sources trace things all the way back to this ancient Dongsun culture. They're famous for these really intricate bronze drums they made. And these weren't just any old drums. They were symbols of, power and ritual. So there was something special going on back then.
That's so cool. And then there's that whole Nam Tien thing, right? What was it? The southward advance, this centuries-long expansion that basically reshaped the entire region.
I think most people think of it as just grabbing land, but it was more than that, right? It was about creating a distinct Vietnamese identity. It was about pushing back against these outside forces, like the Champa kingdom they had down south. They were making a statement, staking their claim in the world.
Right. It really shows that determination and resilience. They've always had that, haven't they? Speaking of outside forces, we can't talk about Vietnamese history without talking about China, right?
No, definitely not. 1,000 years under Chinese rule, that leaves a mark. You can see it in the culture, in the echoes of Confucianism, even in how the government was structured. But even under Chinese control, they never completely lost their own identity.
Absolutely. The sources talked about all these uprisings throughout history, this constant pushback against the Chinese. Almost makes you wonder if, those centuries of resistance actually maybe even strengthen their sense of national identity.
It's totally possible, yeah. Don't we often define ourselves by what we're not? Maybe all those years fighting against Chinese rule helped them figure out who they really were as a people. And that spirit of resistance, well, it definitely found its champion in Ho Chi Minh, right?
Oh, yeah. He's like the ultimate symbol of Vietnam's fight for self-determination. Revolutionary, nationalist, communist. He was all of those things.
Absolutely. He led the fight against the French, and that victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, wow, what a moment. Talk about a turning point. But, even after they finally won independence, they found themselves divided and pulled right into another conflict, the Vietnam War.
It's just like a stark reminder of how that whole Cold War thing turned Vietnam into this proxy battleground. The consequences were just devastating.
Yeah, the sources really drove that home, the human cost of it all. Millions of Vietnamese lives lost, the country just devastated, and then the long-term effects of Agent Orange. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
It really is. But even after going through all of that, the Vietnamese people, they just kept going. They rebuilt their country, dealt with that whole exodus of the boat people, and then, eventually they started to make some big economic changes.
Right, those AMA reforms back in 1986, that was a huge moment. It was like they were switching gears. They went from a centrally planned economy to something more market-oriented. It was a huge gamble.
Totally. It's incredible, though, how they've managed to adapt and find their own path. And that, I guess, leads us to the next chapter in their story, this economic rise that's got everyone's attention.
And that, my friend, is a story for the next part of our deep dive. All right, welcome back to our Vietnam deep dive. So last time we were talking about, their history, geography, all that, and I think it's pretty clear they've been through a lot, right? But now it's time to talk about something really exciting, the Vietnamese economy. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing how they went from a war-torn country to, one of the hottest economies in Southeast Asia.
It's a crazy turnaround, right? What's the secret sauce? How do they pull that off?
Well, I think a big part of it goes back to what we talked about earlier, those OMI reforms in the 80s. They basically said, okay, let's try something new. They went from this super strict, centrally planned economy to something way more market-driven. It was a huge risk.
Yeah, I bet. Imagine just flipping the switch like that. Must have been a huge adjustment for the Vietnamese people.
Yeah.
Going from total state control to suddenly having all this economic freedom.
Oh, for sure. But one thing that really struck me in the sources was how much entrepreneurial spirit the Vietnamese people have. It wasn't just about changing the rules, it was about changing their mindset. People were ready to hustle,
That's so cool. Okay, but what about this socialist-oriented market economy thing? I mean, how does that even work? It sounds kind of like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, right?
Yeah, it's this weird hybrid thing, but honestly, it seems to be working. I mean, look at the numbers. Vietnam has seen some seriously impressive economic growth in the past few decades.
All right, so let's break it down. Where's all this growth coming from? I mean, I know agriculture's always been huge for Vietnam, right? Those rice paddies are, iconic.
Oh, absolutely. Rice is still a major player, feeds millions of people, and brings in a ton of export revenue. But don't forget about coffee. Vietnam's actually the second biggest coffee exporter in the world.
Wow, no way. I had no idea. So I guess what I'm wondering is, as Vietnam develops, is agriculture becoming, less important? Are people moving away from the farms?
It's happening, yeah. It's a pretty classic pattern. As economies develop, people tend to move to the cities looking for jobs in industry or the service sector, more opportunities,
Makes sense. So Vietnam's going through its own kind of industrial revolution then,
Yeah.
right? Which, it's awesome, but I'm sure it comes with its own set of problems. I remember the sources mentioned something about income inequality.
Right. It's that classic problem, Economic growth is great, but you got to make sure everyone benefits. If the gap between rich and poor gets too big, that's going to cause problems. And then there's the environmental side of things too. Industrialization often comes with some not so great environmental consequences.
Yeah, it's that balancing act, right? Growth versus sustainability. But hey, on the plus side, it sounds like Vietnam's been attracting a ton of foreign investment.
Right.
That's got to be helping to fuel all this growth.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Companies all over the world are setting up shop in Vietnam. Cheap labor, strategic location, and increasingly a more skilled workforce. It's a pretty attractive package.
And let's not forget about tourism. I mean, Vietnam is becoming a huge tourist destination. It's got the natural beauty, the amazing food, the vibrant culture. It's going to be a huge boost to the economy, right?
It is, for sure. From the crazy energy of Ho Chi Minh City to the peaceful beauty of Ha Long Bay, there's something for everyone. But, managing all that tourism responsibly, that's the key. Making sure it benefits local communities and doesn't trash the environment.
So many moving parts, right? It's like they're juggling a bunch of different things, trying to keep it all balanced. It really sounds like Vietnam is like a country in motion, constantly evolving. And, what really struck me from the sources is that their economic journey is far from over.
Oh yeah, totally. It's still unfolding. And who knows what twists and turns are coming next, right? I mean, global economics are always changing, and Vietnam is now, they're right in the thick of it. They're part of the World Trade Organization. They've got all these free trade agreements. It's a whole new ball game.
Yeah, it's like they've stepped onto this this global stage,
是
and everyone's watching. That must be a little nerve-wracking,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But also super exciting.
Totally. The sources even mention that the government has this goal of becoming a high-income country by 2045. That's ambitious, but it shows you how much they believe in their potential.
It's amazing. So where does Vietnam go from here? I mean, what are the biggest challenges they're facing?
Well, the sources definitely highlighted a few things. Income inequality, we talked about that. Corruption is another big one. And then there's, the legacy of war, all those unexploded bombs, and the Agent Orange contamination. That's still a huge problem.
Right, and I guess we can't forget about the geopolitical situation either. All that tension in the South China Sea, that's got to be a factor too.
Absolutely. It's complicated stuff, no easy answers. But I think if there's one thing we've learned about the Vietnamese people, it's that they're incredibly resilient and resourceful. They've faced down some serious challenges in their history, and they're not afraid to change and adapt.
So I guess as we wrap up this look at Vietnam's economy, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? There's this amazing energy, this sense of possibility, but also some serious challenges. It's exciting, but kind of uncertain too.
Exactly. But hey, isn't that what makes it so interesting? Now, for the final part of our deep dive, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about Vietnamese society and culture. Everyday life, what are the trends, what's changing, how are people adapting to all this rapid development?
So we've talked about Vietnam's history, their amazing economic rise, but what about the people? Like, what's daily life like in Vietnam today?
Well, one thing that really jumped out from the sources was this whole emergence of a new middle class. It's like economic growth is totally reshaping Vietnamese society,
Yeah, it's like that whole rising tide lifts all boats thing, right? But in this case, it's like a rising tide creating a whole new fleet of boats.
Yeah, exactly. And this new middle class, they're not just sitting back, They're driving consumption, demanding better schools, better healthcare. They're really changing the game.
It's almost like that classic American dream story, right? People working hard, wanting a better life for themselves and their kids.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And speaking of kids, the sources really emphasized how important education is in Vietnamese culture. Parents see it as, like, the golden ticket to a good future.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not like there's a ton of pressure on those kids to succeed, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the competition to get into the best universities is insane. It's a lot of pressure, especially in a culture that, really values respect for elders and doing what's expected of you.
Makes you wonder how young people are dealing with all that, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find their own path while still honoring those traditional values.
It's a balancing act, that's for sure. And speaking of balancing acts, we got to talk about technology, right? Vietnam's got one of the fastest growing internet penetration rates in the world. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's like smartphones are everywhere you look. How's that changing things for people in Vietnam?
Well, it's changing everything, really. How people communicate, how they get their news, how they do business, even how they entertain themselves. Social media, especially platforms like Facebook and Zalo, are huge over there.
It's amazing how technology connects us all.
Right.
But it also comes with its own set of issues, doesn't it? Like, how do you teach people to be smart about what they see online? How do you protect privacy?
Yeah, it's a global problem, right? It's not just a Vietnam thing. We're all trying to figure out how to handle this technology stuff. And on top of that, you've got this massive urbanization happening in Vietnam. Cities like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi are just exploding with people.
I was looking at some pictures, and it's pretty wild. Like, you've got these ancient temples right next to these towering skyscrapers, and then, bustling markets right next to these quiet little alleyways. It seems like such a mix of old and new.
Totally. But all that growth comes with growing pains, right? Traffic jams, pollution, not enough housing. It's tough.
It's like those cities are trying to run a marathon while they're still building the track,
Yeah.
But all this change, it's got to be impacting Vietnamese culture, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's creating this fascinating tension between tradition and modernity. You see it everywhere, in the clothes people wear, the music they listen to, even in, how young people interact with older generations.
Like they're trying to figure out how to hold on to their traditions while also embracing all this new stuff coming in. That's a tough one for sure.
It is. But, one thing that really stood out in the sources was how much Vietnam's art scene is thriving right now. There are all these young artists pushing boundaries, experimenting with new forms of expression, but they're also, still drawing inspiration from their cultural heritage.
It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Right? Respecting the past, but looking towards the future. I don't know, there's just something about Vietnam that feels so, alive and energetic.
Totally. It's a country that never stands still, right? It's always evolving, reinventing itself.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? From those ancient bronze drums to the bustling streets of Ho Chi Minh City. It's been quite a journey.
It has, and hopefully, it sparks some curiosity. Maybe you'll check out some Vietnamese literature, listen to some traditional music, try some pho. Who knows, maybe you'll even book a trip someday.
I know, I'm definitely adding it to my list.
Yeah.
Vietnam is a country of beauty, resilience, and, well, just endless possibilities, it seems. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.